Welcome to Money Talks, a series of interviews with me, Liam Halligan, Economics and Business Editor of GBNews. In this episode, I talk to Nick Allan, CEO of Control Risks, one of the UK's leading security and intelligence consultancies. Control Risks has almost 50 years' experience managing everything from kidnap and ransom situations to providing highly specialised commercial and political research, mainly for corporate clients working overseas. In this rare interview, Allan gives his unique, well-informed take on the main strategic, diplomatic and geopolitical risks facing businesses and nation-states across the world today. Nick, great to have you here on The Money. What is Control Risks? What is the business that you're in?
So we describe ourselves as a specialist risk consultancy. So we advise primarily business. We do work for some governments, but primarily business, and we help them, the sort of strap line is help them become secure, compliant, resilient, sustainable. We provide information to help them make better business decisions, and we also advise business on crises, how to prepare for them, deal with them, and then recover. That's sort of our world, if that brings it a little bit to life.
And a lot of the work that you do is in overseas places, some far-flung markets, but Control Risks has been around for a long time, right?
So we've been around for coming on 47 years, and we started in the area of responding to kidnap and extortion. We still do that with a world-leading company in advising people on that particular risk. Yes, we work in far-flung places, but we also work very close to home. We do a lot of work in the UK and in the European Union. So I think one of the things that's changed for a lot of businesses is when I joined the firm, and that was 20 years ago, quite a lot of what we did was, say, for UK businesses or US, Japanese big client base there. And risk was sort of out there, whether it was political risk or security risk. I think one of the things that changed is risk is here as well, and that's political as well as security issues that we advise companies on. So without wishing to sound too depressing, sort of risk is everywhere, I guess, and we're helping firms deal with that.
How would you assess the extent of geopolitical risk in the world at the moment? The UK is obviously a very outward-facing economy. We trade all over the place. The world's becoming more globalised, or is it after the pandemic? Another issue there. But do you think the world is particularly risky at the moment?
I think, there's always risk, isn't there? And we're more aware of it because of the ubiquity of information that we have. I think someone said a few years back, globalization has had a heart attack. It's not dead. It's in the recovery room, as it were. And I think there's some
with the pandemic.
With the pandemic, with geopolitics, that was said before the pandemic. Okay. I think what we have seen everywhere around the world, and this is something we and others have been talking about, has been the increase in political nationalism, the increase in trade barriers. If you look at just about every metric, you can see increases in barriers to trade, apart from Africa, actually. Africa is sort of moving in the other direction in some ways. So it is harder, I think, getting harder for business. And, and we're all aware of this, just a huge increase in regulation and things that businesses rely on, like free movement of data, getting harder and harder. You've got lots of new data laws coming in. And certainly if you look at it now, and we're looking forward into 2022, for a lot of businesses and people like me and yourself, we grew up in an era where the kind of rules were clear.
Yeah.
It's much less clear.
I think maybe what you were referring to earlier was the emergence of Donald Trump, a much spikier relationship between the two biggest economies in the world, the US and China. That spikiness has continued now. You've been in this business a long time, if I may say so, Nick. How would you assess sort of Sino-western relations at the moment?
Poor would probably be my sort of overarching summary. What Trump articulated, actually, if you look at the one thing I think that drew together the US political, Democrat, Republican, was actually a concern about the rise of China from an American perspective. And actually he got a lot of sort of cross-party support and articulated, I think, a concern that was also being felt elsewhere. And this is, you have a rising economy, a huge population, and a country that is looking to project its power and influence abroad. And there have been, a number of books written on this subject about sort of when empires fall and new empires emerge. And it rarely happens without friction. I think we are now in an age of confrontation, and that doesn't necessarily mean sort of military confrontation, but there is economic, technological, cultural, political confrontation between China, which wishes to assert itself, protects its interests as China would see it. I think it's important to understand there's obviously a Chinese perspective on what's going on. And business is actually finding itself quite often caught in the crossfire.
Of course. We don't always notice what's going on, do we, when we're focused on news in our own country? There's been a huge increase in recent weeks of Chinese military planes in Taiwanese aerospace. That could really be a flashpoint, couldn't it? Because the Chinese feel that Taiwan is part of, if not mainland China, then certainly part of the People's Republic in general. And yet Taiwan is kind of a US ally. To what extent do you think we're ignoring the danger that China poses?
So, I mean, we talked specifically about Taiwan. That is China has always been, the People's Republic of China has always been very clear that Taiwan remains part of China. And, Taiwanese governments flirt with declaring independence, but, they fear going there. Taiwan is a US ally. I mean, in terms of, people were, I think, misreading into the speed with which the US left Afghanistan, that they might sort of similarly abandon their ally Taiwan. Totally different. The US has huge political and economic interest in Taiwan, but Taiwan has huge economic interest in China. There's a lot of Taiwanese investment in China. You have a slowing Chinese economy. It's not growing as fast as it used to. Taiwan is one of those sort of hot button nationalist issues. Some people might say sort of Anglo-French fishing relations work similarly. So I think we don't see a military confrontation happening. There will be saber rattling. There's always the risk for miscalculation. But when I was talking to our team in China just last week, I was sort of discussing this, and they said, look, absolutely it's headline news, but if you're a business, international business operating in China, you're much more worried about Chinese regulators, the tightening of regulatory investigations that have been going on in China, the sort of internal politics of China present more of an issue for business to get its head around than actually the sort of headline news that is sort of, are we going to go to war over Taiwan? I don't think we are.
We should be in no doubt, though, that you have America as the world's leading economy, the global hegemon, if you like, as it has been pretty much for our entire lives. That's now shifting. Under some definitions, China is the biggest economy in the world already. That shift isn't going to happen without some kind of aggro, is it? I mean, these are very competitive countries run by very competitive people. I mean, how can Britain position itself? How can British business position itself as this global centre of gravity shifts as it now is?
I think we're not at the end of the age of the American superpower. If you look militarily and the ability to project power abroad, the US is unrivaled. If you look at the number of, just sort of aircraft carriers China has versus the United States, there was the thing this week about China increasing its nuclear warheads, still dwarfed by what the US has. So there's a bit of perspective, and in terms of GDP per capita, the US is still an economic superpower and will continue to be. But what you have is a US less interested in projecting that power and influence. I think bruised from multiple conflicts in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And for Britain, which is an interesting question, brands Britain as a sort of business brand, I think remains very strong, particularly in places where we're known for, professional services, some of our industry, manufacturing, creative arts. There's opportunity there. We are a trading nation, we always have been. And, notwithstanding tensions with the European Union at the moment, Britain, I think our position remains to sort of exploit the strengths that we have. We remain on the UN Security Council. We have a security capability that probably is stronger than, it's always been strong, and we still have that. So I guess in that mix, Britain has opportunity, but we can't be complacent.
Let's talk about cybercrime. Obviously, it's a growing threat. Ordinary householders can have their bank hacked, they can have their identity stolen, and so on. Have we seen anything yet? Could this become a much bigger trend? Nick, how worried are big business about cyber attacks?
If it's not in the top one or two items on a business risk register, they should look at their risk register again.
Crikey.
I mean, it is a huge issue. And since during the pandemic, there was an explosion in cybercrime, particularly ransomware. And we as a firm that respond to that just saw that, just a massive demand.
Just describe to us what ransomware is.
So when you accidentally, your computer is affected by a program that encrypts all your files, and a little message pops up and says, if you're an individual, probably pay me a few hundred to a few $1,000s to get your information back. If you're a business, and we've seen some of these, pay X million dollars and we will unencrypt your information.
You're far too professional to even think about disclosing client confidentiality, and I hope I'm not stupid enough to ask. But what size of companies are we talking about that you've dealt with who have been hit with ransomware?
Well, I'm not going to talk about who we've worked for, but some very big sort of, headline cyber attacks. Colonial Pipeline in the States, probably, the big one last year. SolarWinds, which was again another that was attributed to Russian software. But for all businesses,
and these ransoms get paid.
These ransoms do get paid. It is a crime that's very hard to solve, and it's facilitated, let's be clear, by Bitcoin,
cyber currencies that can't be traced.
That can't be traced.
Or very difficult to trace.
Very difficult to trace. So for all business, I think, and it's not just ransomware, it's hacks, it's data theft. And the challenge with a data theft is it's very hard to know what's actually happened. It can take quite a long time to really get a sense of, has the data really been taken, what's been taken, and under regulations, you have to report relatively quickly before you may know what's happened. So this is really a challenging risk for business, and it's going to get worse. We see cybercrime following geopolitical tension. We've already talked about geopolitical tension. We see the leaking of state-level capability to criminal groups. So you now have criminal groups with really very sophisticated software capabilities to prosecute this kind of crime, and the resources of business to stand up to that. The really big businesses, the banks are heavily regulated. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars, pounds, euros, yen on this. But for medium-sized business, it's harder, and smaller businesses even harder to protect against this. So this absolutely is a critical risk for business, and it's going to get worse, unfortunately.
You talked about small and medium-sized businesses there, Nick. If somebody watching this has a relatively small business, they might have, client bank accounts on the business, standing orders that have been set up and so on. How can they go about making just simple precautions to make their business more resilient to cyber attack?
Resilience is a good word, isn't it? You need to have a backup of your information, of your client's information, and you need to know how to use your backup. And there are lots of firms that help people do that. But if you haven't got a backup, you need a backup. That's my sort of number. If we were asking sort of what's your business tip, I'd say number one, have a backup of your information. And you need to also thought through how long can you trade and operate if you can't access that information. And you are seeing, unfortunately, small, medium-sized businesses being hit and really not knowing kind of what to do. But there are companies that will support. There are lots of companies that and the UK, if we're talking about the UK, has a very strong capability in the area of cyber security and preventing this. We have in GCHQ, I guess, a world leading organisation, and people have come out of that and set up businesses. And actually, in terms of you asked me where can Britain sort of succeed? I think our cyber security capability is an area where we have real strength. And I think you already see that, and you're going to see more of that. British firms trading around the world. COP26
has obviously been big news this month. Do you think the UK does need to worry about its energy security? We haven't got much gas storage these days. President Macron's threatening to turn off the interconnectors. We're pretty reliant, aren't we, on that gas pipeline from Norway? What's the sort of big picture view of risk specialists like you when people ask about energy security in the UK?
Well, I saw in one of your previous interviews, Liam, you asked a Norwegian gentleman about how Norway viewed our lack of gas storage facilities, and he was very diplomatic. It's quite clear in terms of how sort of pipelines have been built that Russia is well aware of how much gas it supplies to Europe, and that does provide
40% of Western Europe's gas.
Exactly,
still.
and we know that, and they know that, and there's positives and negatives to that. It creates an interdependence, but at the same time, it does. Energy supply has always given countries leverage throughout time. So Why we have not insufficient gas storage, certainly compared to mainland Europe, that's a question I'm not equipped to answer, but we do need to worry about energy supply. We're building renewable power. We have, I guess, oil and gas reserves of our own. But yeah, it's a critical issue, and we've seen that in the price spikes. Things that the British government, try as it might, can't really control, I guess, without spending billions in subsidies. So it's a real issue, and you're going to see that around the world. These energy has always been a source of tension. Many people may not have noticed, but Algeria has just refused to supply gas through the Moroccan pipeline to Spain just this week. And that is creating sort of tensions between Spain, Morocco, Algeria. Algeria and Morocco have sort of poor relations. But that's a sort of small example of, I think, an issue that is kind of out there and is going to define, the next while.
But even if we move to renewables, and obviously we are shifting to renewables, there have been weeks recently where 50% of British use electricity has been from renewables. This isn't a joke. But let's say we live in a world of wind and solar and electric cars. That doesn't make us geostrategically safe, does it? Those batteries in those electric cars, they use rare earths. China's got lots of those rare earths. The Central African Republic's got lots of those rare earths. These minerals, these elements that we need. We've got hardly any.
Yeah, I think there might be some in Cornwall, but I think I'm right in saying that.
Reprise Pole Dark, and we'll all go down the mines in Cornwall.
I think there is a plan to sort of reopen some of the tin mines because of rare earths, and that is about energy security. I mean, you're right. You see, China does have significant access to rare earths, and they understand the importance of that. And you see Chinese mining companies, particularly in Africa. You've mentioned Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, another place where these earths are being mined. These are all areas of future tension and competition, I guess. And Western countries, I guess, have largely relied on the private sector to go and exploit these resources. Emerging economies, particularly the big ones, China, India, have done it more, I guess, using state-owned enterprises or parastatal organizations. And I think you are starting to see the push from Western countries to get companies to exploit these resources. And that's tricky because these are often, not always, but often in countries that are difficult to operate in. And a lot of Western companies face quite a lot of scrutiny in terms of how they operate on the ground. And that is a challenge for the private sector in terms of how it does that.
A lot of people who read the business press maybe have a little bit of money that they need to manage. They may dabble in stocks and shares. They'll have seen these initials ESG. Tell us what ESG means and why it's important.
So it's environmental, social and governance. I mean, that's the E, the S and the G. And there is driven really by investors, particularly institutional investors, pressure on companies to up their game, I guess, in terms of how they approach the environment. And COP26 is very much in the news now, but that has been something because of the climate crisis that companies absolutely have to be part of the solution. Then social issues, how do companies operate on the ground? And that's not just in, to use your phrase, far-flung places, but also here in the UK. How do companies engage with social issues, and then governance in terms of, and that's we're talking about, corruption issues, integrity, how well governed companies are. And all firms are having to engage with this, I think, in a much more structured way because regulators are looking at it. And there's a lot of discussion going on at the moment between government and business as to how much needs to be regulated and how much does business do for itself. And companies are focused on this issue and engage with it. But there are challenges. If you operate, a lot of British businesses, talking about international firms operating in countries where the rule of law doesn't apply, where regulation is arbitrary or sometimes worse than that, it's politicized. And those are real challenges for business to engage with this whole issue.
ESG, it's, if I may use the phrase, fashionable now in the Western world. Regulators are getting involved. Is there a danger, Nick, we can undermine our international competitiveness here? You've got, hard-driving emerging markets now who are bestriding the world. China, India, Russia. These are big economies. These are big competitive places. They're not bothered about ESG.
It sort of depends on the big sort of global firms that come out of emerging markets. Absolutely, they are engaged with these issues and they operate to international standards. I don't think anyone would say British business or US business shouldn't operate ethically and appropriately. I think the challenge is that understanding how to manage those risks is difficult. It can be expensive. And depending on how those are regulated, some firms are already thinking, actually, we won't go here because it's just too difficult. And I guess the concern is if good businesses don't go to difficult places, less good businesses will. The business will happen. And that probably has a detrimental effect in those countries where they're operating. So that's, I guess, how I see it.
We couldn't conduct an interview like this, Nick, without mentioning terrorism, of course, a major subject on the minds of many businesses that you will help in your work as a consultant. Where do you think the main terrorist threats are coming from at the moment? And to what lengths do businesses go, both British businesses operating here and internationally, to meet those terrorist threats?
So, terrorist threat comes from ungoverned spaces. The concern around what's happening in Afghanistan is that ungoverned spaces will appear, and you're already seeing terrorist groups, ISIS-K and others with much more leeway to operate. And they are a threat to the Taliban rule in Afghanistan and, unfortunately, Afghani citizens. So ungoverned spaces, if we're talking particularly around the Islamist threat, so what's going on in the Sahel in northern Africa, that's why you have French...
That's the bit just below, between the Sahara and the southern coast.
Exactly, so it's countries like Mali, where you have French and British troops sort of trying to deal with that threat in that area at the moment for that very reason. So that's where, I guess, the threat incubates from that side. But also, we have seen the threat from extremist groups, much more domestic, both far right and far left. And actually, I think sometimes that's overlooked. And if you look in a number of countries, the threat from those extremist groups is as severe as, if not stronger than, the sort of Islamist threat that I think a lot of certainly the media focuses on.
But this is a real issue for lots of businesses. They have to take precautions, right?
Yes, it's a real issue for all of us, and business has a duty to protect, and business needs to understand the threat, and it always depends on where you are and what you're doing. And so that is, you see businesses putting in place security measures, sort of crisis management, planning around what you do if something happens. But certainly, if we're talking in this country, we really are largely depending on the capability of our security services to protect us. It's what they do, and they do it well. Unfortunately, it's as the cliche is, and a terrorist only needs to be lucky once. But it is a risk business is concerned about. But it is typically a low frequency, high impact event. So business needs to be concerned about it to manage it. But there are lots of other risks out there that are much more sort of relevant on a daily basis.
Final question, Nick. Control Risks is famously an international company. Many of your people are, if you like, worldly wise. They have lots of overseas experience and often operate overseas. So let me put this to you. This idea of global Britain, is that real? Is that credible?
Behind any sort of slogan, there's an element of truth, isn't there? I think, Britain has always been a trading nation. Britain is a wonderfully diverse country, and that is a huge source of strength. British business has always gone out there and done business across the world, and will continue to do so. I think it is part of our business culture. All international businesses are finding the environment difficult and complicated, but sort of as we emerge from the pandemic, from our clients, there is a sense of optimism. It's a strange time. There's optimism couched with caution because there's still a lot of uncertainty out there. But the flip side of risk is opportunity. If I can sort of finish on another cliche, Liam, but that is very true, and it's how you manage those risks to deliver the opportunity. That's what we're about, and we work for some fantastic companies and that's what they're all about too.
That was a really interesting interview. Nick Allan, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks a lot for listening to Money Talks with me, Liam Halligan, economics and business editor of GB News. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening. Do subscribe to this podcast and also check out my daily television show, On the Money, at 1 p.m. Monday to Friday on GB News or via the GB News app. GB News, Britain's news channel.